just going over what the revolution did and a little bit of historiography, the history of history, especially in this time period where we're kind of straddling the border between the end of the American Revolution and the decade of the 1780s, which we're going to get started on Thursday. So kind of the chronological approach is going to begin next class. But I have to leave off, or have to begin, by leaving off with the American Revolution, which is the most critical event in the lives of these individuals. I mean, up to the Revolution, it would have been the French and Indian War and all of the different reforms that England put in the 1760s and 70s, which brought about an American rebellion by 1775, certainly, and officially in 1776. So the story begins in 1783. And it begins with the Treaty of Paris, which ends the American Revolution. A war that was 8 years long. Not a lot of people realize that. You can't just stop when the fighting ends, basically at the surrender of Yorktown in 1781, because the British still have an army in North America. So the war really ends in 1783. And that is when the French and the United States and the British, and again, Spain's involved. They certainly help the United States. But the three major parties at play are the United States, the French, and the English. The United States had always wanted to bring in foreign aid, and they did with the French, and then they went behind the French nation's back and said, we're going to negotiate a separate peace with Great Britain, even though we told the French to join us and to be our ally. You can't negotiate a separate peace with Great Britain. And then we go and do it all our own, forcing the French to just kind of end the war between themselves and Great Britain. I can promise you that not everyone in Europe was thrilled about the results of the American Rebellion, the success. Some nations love the fact that England, of course, was somewhat humbled and humiliated by what took place, why a bunch of folks with pitchforks and pig farmers were able to defeat Great Britain, which had 20 years before really seen the apex of its power at the end of the French and Indian War, where France defeated both Spain and England defeated both France and Spain together. And then 20 years later, they've lost 13 of their mainland colonies. And so we can understand that this was something new. Again, it's almost a foregone conclusion 200 plus years later that this was the course of events that was going to happen. It was inevitable. This was, again, no doubt was ever suggested of anything short of an American victory. But the odds were very long. The English were reluctant to end fighting the rebellion. That's why it took nearly 2 years from the end of the fighting at Yorktown, which is October 1781, until the peace treaty is formalized, really about a year and a half later. And then after that, the army is quickly demobilized. George III, the King of England, the sovereign king, who was unfortunately the monarch who has to see this empire come apart. A civil war, we might say, within the British Overseas Empire, within the British Empire itself, sees this, what we might say, the secession of the 13 American colonies. He even refused to use the word independence. He instead tells everyone around him the separation of the colonies. Well, they're not colonies anymore. They were states before Congress ever declared independence. Made that clear last semester, and I'll just repeat the idea that the Congress followed what the states were doing. The states said, we're independent from Great Britain, you in Congress do it too. You know, it's the old, is the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail argument. And in this case, we traditionally think it's from a top down. You know, Congress had told the states to, again, separate formally from Great Britain, but the states were doing it. North Carolina felt it was independent almost a year before Congress made that all-important July vote. But the king, not thrilled. You know, if you're familiar with the musical, the king has, in Hamilton, he has his own song where he says, you'll be back, right? That's the they're going with some kind of 70s pop kind of theme where it's a breakup between a couple. And you know what? That's not too far off as far as an attitude expressed by English people. The English citizenry made the revolution end. There were military defeats, yes, but I would argue, and others have argued as well, that the English people lost support of the war. They voted people into parliament, the English government that pledged to stop fighting the war, not sending another army, not reinforcing their tremendous loss at Yorktown, and begging for peace. There would be anti-war protests in England in 1781 and 1782. And the writing was on the wall when the people chose a new government, a peace government with a new prime minister. And the king was reluctant, but the king's power is limited back then and today. And he may not have been happy about it, but that's essentially what took place. So what does it mean as far as the amount of territory that changes hands? Well, you're probably familiar with it. We have this old beat up map in the classroom, but I'll just say that the United States now extends to the Mississippi River. We again, do not extend to the Pacific. The nation across the Mississippi River would be that of New Spain. France has gone from North America ever since 1763. The British remain in Canada, and our neighbor to the south, this English gave back Florida to the Spanish. English tried to start both parts of Florida, the peninsula of Florida and the panhandle that goes all the way across modern Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, all the way up to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So it includes, again, not just Florida. You have to think Florida differently than you would as the modern state. And so the English were never really able to get English men and women to go to Florida. They weren't able to keep the Spanish there because everyone in Spain was told you have to take a new solemn oath to your new sovereign and King George III, and the Spanish people there were not happy with it, and they fled. A lot of them went to Cuba, a lot of them went to Louisiana, and other parts of the Spanish New World. So I'm setting the stage for talking about what's going to happen in the 1780s. We have neighbors on our borders, and those neighbors are actually part of an overseas empire by the English and by the Spanish. And we had just led an anti-colonial rebellion where we overthrew the king's rule at least in North America, and said that sovereignty can rest with the people or the individual. They were still uncertain about that. Now, there are two founding moments. We'll talk about that in some detail today. Okay. England, of course, at the end of this, vowed to protect the property of the Loyalists, Americans who remain loyal, or sometimes you hear the phrase Tories, because it's a political party in England, the Tories, who were more loyal to the king and the power of the monarchy as opposed to the Whigs, W-H-I-G-S, who were loyal to Parliament and the people's representatives. Those were political parties in England. But part of the Treaty of Paris 1783 stipulated that the new American independent nation, the United States, had to protect the rights of loyalists. Thousands of them, 30, 50,000, we think, probably left North America. Remember, the American Revolution is not only a civil war or a war between the English and the American colonists, it's a war within America because people take sides. Possibly 20 or 25% of the American colonial population was loyal to Great Britain. What do these folks do? What happens to them in the aftermath of the war if they stay? Well, you were supposed to respect their property rights, a lot of which was confiscated because you chose the wrong side as far as the American patriots were concerned. But that didn't negate property. You held the property, you took the wrong side, and that doesn't mean that you should lose your livelihood forever as the aftermath. The other stipulation of the Treaty of Paris that's critical for us to understand is that British soldiers will remain on American soil. We'll talk about this in more detail on Thursday. So we have pressure coming from The British in Canada, British soldiers on American soil in the Northwest. The Northwest, I don't mean what's now Washington State, Oregon, and Idaho. I mean Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana. That's the Northwest. It's north and west of the Ohio River. You see the map here, it is the light green color above Kentucky. It's going to be 5 future states. And so those soldiers are there, and we always are arguing with the British, why are the soldiers there? They should leave. We're a sovereign, independent nation. And the answer we get from the English is, as soon as your war debts are paid, not the debt that the country piled up because it was expensive to fight the English for 8 years, but Americans had debt to English creditors and Scottish creditors going back before 1776. And the British said, just because you won your little War of Independence doesn't mean those account books are all cleared out. So the troops stay until you pay your pre-war debts. And that's going to be tough because the economy is not in great shape. And in the South, 10% of American slaves are gone. They found their freedom one way or the other. They fled with the British. They joined a militia unit or a Continental Army unit, or they left. They ran away. And so that was part of the story that's going to beg the question for the 1780s. Was it a critical period, as some historians have called it, or were things temporarily bad, maybe going to get better? It's still something we debate to this day. Well, a man on the scene who was not able to provide guidance in this trying times is George Washington. He makes the greatest exit in American history at the end of 1783. Walks in front of his officers who are about to storm Congress for back pay and pensions and says, nope, can't do it. You will dishonor your memory and the memory of the American Revolution. And with a simple act of putting on reading glasses, I kid you not, some of you are familiar with this story. He puts his glasses on. He says, look, I've gone gray, and it appears now I've gone nearly blind. He's trying to read a letter from a congressman who says, look, we're going to take care of you, the officers. And he puts these glasses on, and there's this kind of collective sigh from everyone in the audience, because only his inner circle had seen that Washington needs to use reading glasses. And, you know, it's not one of those things where you just make this story up because it sounds great and it's amazing. This happened this way. And the officers all vote confidence in Congress and in Washington, and they're not going to march on Congress, and it's over. And then the army demobilizes. Washington finds Congress, which is kind of like by 1783 a rock band on tour, because they keep running around mostly because elements of the army, the enlisted men, are looking for them to shake them down for money. States refuse to host them in their respective town or city. Sometimes they run from the British Army, and in this case, they're in Annapolis, Maryland. And Washington hands back his commission that he was given 8 years before and says, I now retire. You know, this is the way a revolution doesn't always end, and rarely ends. But the guy who some people thought should declare himself King George I of North America, he's like, nope, never, not going to do it, nope. And these letters you write me, you should stop writing letters that suggest that, because it's going to look really bad to you. It's bad enough I got to answer him by saying no, 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 hell no. Those people around him are now going to be always connected to that possible scenario, which he wants no part of. So he hands the commission back. George III is told that this is what Washington does, and George III, the King of England, says if this story is true, he'll be the greatest man ever. Because the leader of the revolution doesn't walk away from leading the revolution. They become something else, and we can talk about all revolutions in history, how they sometimes end. The Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution produces Napoleon, so on and so forth. Washington says, I'm done. And at Christmas Eve, 1783, he's home in Mount Vernon. Then everyone thinks this is, you know, the last public appearance he will make. He certainly thinks that. He'd like to stay retired. But he's never completely out of the public's attention, even after his resignation from the army. He hosts a lot of people at his home, Mount Vernon, Mount Vernon. Wow. Swarm with visitors. Again, back then, you know, people didn't call right ahead of time. They just dropped in, and you were supposed to be a good host until your guests wore out their welcome, and then you gave them signs to actually leave. These folks asked for his advice. I mean, he is the most famous man in North America, maybe besides Franklin. Franklin is definitely retired and definitely very old at this point. In the spring of 1784, Washington sees that he is involved in an affair he doesn't really want to be involved in. It's one of national concern, and he links his name to it, and it becomes controversial. The veterans of the Army, especially the officers, put together what they call the Order of Cincinnati. Order of Cincinnati. Now, Cincinnatus is the Roman general who literally puts down the plow and picks up the spear or sword that they used back then and saves the Roman Republic, and then goes back to the farm. That's why they often call Washington. There's a book about him called Cincinnatus. So these founders very much tried to model themselves or their nation they were creating on the virtuous Roman Republic. And so that's why you see a lot of their writings, when they write under a pen name, they use characters from ancient Rome or Greece. Publius, Cincinnatus, things like that. So Washington is the American Cincinnatus. But the Order of the Cincinnati is a real thing. It's going to be something of a society of Republican, again, not the political party, those who are protecting the Republican form of government, the Republican officers at several levels. It will be an inherited, passed down from one generation to another. It's also filled with many veterans of the war who were born in another country. Folks from Poland, France, Austria, we know them. Thaddeus Kosciuszko, the Polish engineer. Baron von Steuben, who was a complete fraud, but it didn't matter because he was good at training the soldiers. Lafayette, and others. Baron de Kalb, I believe is German, dies at the Battle of Camden in 1780. Well, they were going to be in this society as well. So it gave people pause. First of all, that there were a lot of foreign officers, again, whose credentials weren't always good, and they weren't always good officers. And in fact, when Congress got the so-called credentials of these foreign officers, the American-born officers were like, why are these folks being promoted faster than me? It caused a lot of resentment. And the other factor is, of course, that hereditary idea, where in the United States, we don't have a titled nobility. In the American colonies, we don't have a titled nobility. Now, where you have a title that's passed from one generation to another. That's in England, not in the American colonies. We have a nobility of wealth, possibly, a nobility of education, but, you know, Lord Farquaad of the realm, I know, this guy from Shrek or whatever. But I mean, the title that goes from one, I mean, the guy's name could be John Smith, but his title is, you know, Lord Farquaad. And we don't have that. I mean, they have people who are maybe royal governors who have that title, but they are British born, not American born. I mean, Washington's highest goal was to be an officer in the British Army, except he couldn't because he was a Washington and he was American born. So that never was going to happen. So the Order of the Cincinnati. And Washington, to no one's surprise, you know, big tall guy, we'll call him that throughout this class because he, again, gets a lot of prominent roles in his life because he is the tallest guy in the room. Maybe unless Jefferson's there, then they'd be about the same in height. Anywho, Washington is, to no one's surprise, going to be the first president general of the Order of the Cincinnati. And Washington suggests that, considering that the Order of Cincinnati is coming under a lot of fire in the American press and among those in political circles, maybe we should put in some changes to it. Take out the hereditary. I mean, this is not how it should be done here in the United States, maybe in England and Europe. Hopefully, he thinks, if these changes go into place, it will be more palatable for people to understand and appreciate the Order of the Cincinnati. You know, it wouldn't be such a closed, elitist group. This is not what the revolution was about. And so he's dreading that the Order of the Cincinnati is thinking about holding a meeting sometime in the late 1780s. Looks like it's going to be 1786 or 1787. And Washington is also, again, 1783, he would be, what, 51 years old? Not particularly old, but he was always concerned that Washingtons don't live very long, so, might as well enjoy some retirement while we can. He heads out to the headwaters of the Ohio River, a trip he had taken, 30 years before, when he was a young officer in the Virginia Regiment and was telling the French, that little area that we now know as Pittsburgh, that's British territory. You all should leave. And the French said, in French, I'll translate, no, they're not leaving. They're going to go anywhere. So he'd be familiar with the area. He's checking on his land, and he's, again, noticing a few things. A lot of people are squatting on his land, meaning they are improving it, using it without his permission, or without, more specifically, paying for it. And he also is understanding that the Ohio River, the Potomac River, this is going to be the system which really opens up the rest of the continent. I said before last time that Washington and a lot of people in Virginia hope that the Potomac is this very critical artery into the interior of the continent. And it isn't, because there are falls along it that are very difficult to negotiate, and it's not really a navigable river when you get further west. But, hope springs eternal. And if you can use the river, your land prices skyrocket, right? I mean, if you're parked near the Ohio River, which will link you to the Mississippi, jackpot. So every waterway and river is a way to move things and people. All right, so that kind of sets the stage for what's happening with some of the issues at the end of the American Revolution. Let's talk a little bit about the revolutionary generation and what the revolution did accomplish. There are 5 major achievements. Sometimes we call this group the Founding Brothers. There's a book on it called Founding Brothers. I don't think I brought it. I have a couple of copies. I brought some other ones written by Joseph Ellis. Oh, this is one of the books that I mentioned last time, the Quartet. This argument that 4 individuals are critical in changing the goal of the revolution in 1776 from 1787.
Is that a big book? Because I don't want to read that.
It is a good book, but I would suggest if you want to get involved in his style and familiar with it, that you should buy Founding Brothers or American Creation. Okay, Founding Brothers and American Creation are 2 books. And I will tell you, they read like mini lectures on certain topics. One, I get the chapters confused in the books a little bit, but one chapter is called The Duel. So that's Hamilton and Burr. Yes. Another is called The Purchase. If you want to know anything about the Louisiana Purchase, I would tell everybody, read this chapter. It is one of the best brief treatments of the issues involved in the Louisiana Purchase, and it shifts the credit away from Jefferson, which I think it should be, and where it should be given to. And those are the slaves on Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, who make it impossible for Napoleon to reestablish a French empire there and put down the slave rebellion, because he was going to take those soldiers, put down the slave rebellion, didn't happen, all the soldiers died, and launch that army to Louisiana. And it didn't happen. And then all of a sudden he sells it. What are the other chapters? The Friendship on Jefferson and Madison. There's one called The Silence, which, again, these are lecture prep books for me. The Silence is on the introduction of anti-slavery resolutions in Congress, in the first Congress. It's called The Silence because they don't want to talk about it. One is on the winter. I think there's one on Valley Forge. There might be. I'm trying to get this book straight with all the others. And then, yeah, this one too. But he is an excellent writer. He's written not complete, but episodic biographies on Washington, Adams, Jefferson, the Adams family, not that Adams family, the John Quincy Adams, Abigail, But yeah, those books are good because you can just get into it and say, I'm just going to read a one chapter, and they're independent. It's not like a biography where you're reading like a straight kind of beginning to end of the life, or in this case, you're reading from 1783 to 1789. It's you pick it up and you can jump around. You know, you can read that section on Louisiana, you can read that section on one chapter is called The Year, and it's really on how we get from the Battle of Lexington and Concord to the vote on independence. Anyway.
What did you say the name of that book was?
Sure. One I believe is called American Founding. Let me go. Hang on. We have the internet here. This is wonderful, isn't it? So let's see here. Give me a minute. I know whoever's with us on Teams. Let me see here. Oh, I know. I'm going to Amazon. It's called, I know, Founding Brothers. Okay, that's it. It's in paperback. The Revolutionary Generation. Okay, so let's, I don't know, we're getting off track, but so what? It's okay. The Duel is on Burr and Hamilton. The dinner between Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton about let's pass my financial plan, and then we'll move the capital to the American South. The Silence, okay, that's on 1790 anti-slavery resolutions in Congress. The Farewell is Washington's farewell, retirement from the presidency. The Collaborators, I think that's on Madison and Jefferson, and The Friendship, I believe, is on Jefferson and Adams, the history of how they fell out and then came back together. So that's Founding Brothers. The other is
American Creation.
American Creation. Thank you. Okay. His other books are really good. I think he's a good writer.
And the Founding Brothers, did any of y'all like have Audible, like the Prime membership, or Audible? It's free with the thing.
Oh, there you
Audible
go.
Plus,
Okay.
The Founding Brothers is free for Audible Plus members.
Okay. Right. So this one's on the years on 1776. The winter is on Valley Forge, being a critical year for the Continental Army. The argument, again, I've read this a while ago. I don't remember all of them. The treaty, I believe, is on maybe the treaty of the treaty between the United States and Great Britain. The conspiracy, I think, is also on political parties. And the Purchase, okay, this is the one. The Purchase, I know, is on the Louisiana Purchase. So anyway, they're just recommendations. And you know what? We'll go back to the share screen, sorry. To be a good writer, you have to identify good writing. And I'm not a great writer, but I know what bad writing is. That's one of my professors at LSU always made that claim, and he was a good writer, and he was not a bad writer. So you have to know how to write well, and you have to recognize good writing. And if you want, you know, my other professor at LSU used to say, if you want to know what good writing is, pick up The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt and just read the prologue. Now, this is not, you know, he was born in 18. No, this is literally New Year's Day, 1905, maybe, because the president used to, believe it or not, come out and shake hands of people who would come to the White House on New Year's Day in a year, and he shook probably tens of thousands of hands. And it sets the stage so well. It puts you right there. What's that? It couldn't happen nowadays, for a lot of obvious reasons. But what also you have to understand is that, you know, to be able to set the stage very effectively and almost put you like you were in line to go there and shake Theodore Roosevelt's hand. So anyway, I hope you all come across authors in your life that you say, I don't care if this person, he or she, writes my owner's manual of my car as a book. I will pick that up and read it, no matter what. I mean, there are authors, I don't, even if it's not in the time period I really am interested in. I will say, if he or she writes a book, I'm gonna pick up that book and read it, because it's just so well done as far as their writing style. I'm a fan of it. I'm a fan of Ellis because he writes in the time period I'm most interested in, but there are other folks that have written in other time periods, and I mean, Professor Freeman's one of them too. She's really, really, really good, and she moved from this book, The Founding, to the 1850s, and so that was something of a dramatic change, but it kind of makes sense because she moved from the 1790s, we said maybe the most contentious decade in American history, to the 1850s, which is one of the other ones. So that in some ways makes sense. Okay, so I got off on a tangent as usual, but we'll try to get back here. Okay, so what did the founding generation do? Where were their successes and where were their failures? We're going to talk about both, obviously. Their first and dramatic is that they won a first successful war for independence, colonial independence in modern times. And there are others that happen after. This is the first in modern times, against very long odds. Again, we kind of set the stage for that. It was 8 years, a lot of blood-soaked months. The casualties as proportion of the population were second highest to the Civil War, which a lot of people don't recognize and realize, because you think, oh, World War I, World War II. Yeah, numbers were higher. But as far as how many people were involved, killed and wounded, and as I said last semester, the wounded all die. I mean, there's when you're wounded in the American Revolution, you're probably you're dead. I mean, your chances of coming back are not very good. And so,
with gangrene, because they
yes,
don't understand all the.
Sure.
Somehow the one who beat those off is Benedict Arnold.
What's that?
Somehow the one who beat those off is Benedict Arnold.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Who kind of died in obscurity back in England not long at the end of the American Revolution. But yeah, he has an interesting story because, man, if he had died at Saratoga, he would have been like a hero of the battle and one of the martyrs of the American Revolution. But he lived long enough to basically sell his services to the highest bidder, the English. Yeah. What's that?
I mean, now we remember, like, there's some that aren't remembered because he was so high.
Sure.
And then he degraded everyone.
Right. And you go from the knee-jerk reaction to, Washington literally wanted to go get this guy captured. I mean, he trained and had the army set aside a group that was going to go capture him if they could, and they came close to it, and then he wanted to hang him, and he wanted to probably be there for the hanging. And after the revolution, everyone's like, oh, he's America's #1 traitor, and now the evaluation of him has changed. Oh, yes, he is a traitor, but when the bullets start flying, this is the guy you want in command because he was very, very adept and skilled, especially at keeping the revolution going. I mean, the year before Saratoga, if it's not for Benedict Arnold, it may have all come undone with the British invading out of Canada, but he prevented it from happening. Okay. Secondly, and Washington said this was a standing miracle, obviously, that the revolution was successful. But as some people have pointed out, the French were also responsible and might have something to say about that as well. I don't think we are successful without the French, or if we are, it would have taken much longer. It turns the American Rebellion into a world war. It truly does. And it's a game changer for the English. Secondly, legacies. We established the first nation-sized republic. There was an assumption throughout world history that republics can exist, but they have to be very small. The Greek Republic, the Roman Republic in its infancy, but a continental-wide, and we were about halfway across the continent in 1783, that only, Greek city-states and Swiss cantonments, where you have these tiny little geographic areas, is where you can establish a nation that rests its decisions on the will of popular opinion. Now, this is not democracy in 2021 as it is in 1783. Again, it's for adult white males. Nevertheless, it's going to turn every standing theory on its head that no king, no queen, no elite class as far as royalty, as far as a title nobility existing, would actually be able to survive. Third, the revolutionary generation created a wholly secular state with complete separation of church and state. Now, this is, in today's dialogue, controversial to say the least. You know, we are still grappling with what that means. What does the so-called separation of church and state, which everyone claims Jefferson said, but he was applying it not to the United States, that there should be a wall, is his famous phrase, a wall between church and state. What this simply means is that the government of the United States did not create an official religion of the United States. So the president isn't the head of the executive branch and the Church of the United States, because it doesn't exist. And everyone in this, most people in the 1780s thought that is an invitation to disaster, because the king or queen or crown prince or whatever is in charge of and is the religious head of the nation. Even if you have religious dissenters. I mean, England, he's the head of the church. There are Catholics in England. There are Presbyterians. There are Baptists. There are Methodists. There are Quakers. There are Congregationalists. And in England, it works. You know, they didn't line up enemies of the state based on their religious faith and execute them. And this didn't happen in the United States either. So we can argue to this day what separation of church and state. Can you have the 10 Commandments in a courthouse? These are still active debates to this day. But at the end, that's what that means. A wholly secular, meaning there is not an official. And that doesn't mean that faith and religion is not important. It's very important to these individuals. I mean, they still start a session of Congress with a prayer. They did it in the last session that just got sworn in January. And
once that witnessed the shooting, I'm sorry, I was trying to make a really, really bad joke, I'm sorry.
what's that?
The shooting in the Capitol.
Oh, this happened before. I mean, the prayer and the swearing in of the new members. What's right.
Oh,
Yeah, which again was somewhat controversial because amen doesn't mean amen. It literally means
Wait,
It's
really?
Latin.
yeah.
They made it, they said a man and a woman at the end?
Yeah.
The individual gave the prayer. Yeah, it making a point, I guess, but it's the context was a little bit incorrect because amen doesn't mean literally amen.
It wasn't a little bit correct, but yeah.
Well, yeah, I know. There was again, cameras are rolling. It's maybe for better or worse in American Congress that these folks are also TV stars. There was a day when it wasn't the case. But hey, nevertheless, we're not engaging in modern political things that are happening. But it is the idea that if it's not established at the national level, it's still in the states. I mean, the Congregational or the Puritan Church remains the official state-supported, tax-supported church in New England until the 1830s, and it's a couple states. So that means at the national level. At the state level, I mean, the South begins to secularize, and Jefferson disconnects the state, the colony of Virginia and the state of Virginia with the Anglican, or as we call it in the States, the Episcopal Church, during the time of the American Revolution. He thinks it's one of his greatest accomplishments. Jefferson, again, during his time in office, as he runs for office, is accused of being an atheist. He's probably not an atheist. He definitely is someone, like a lot of the founders, who would probably think of himself as a deist, someone who thinks that God created the heavens and earth, and then, all right, away you go. Or someone said it's like winding a watch that doesn't need a battery. The old watch is where the motion of the watch kept the watch going. You wind it, and it's going. And another stated another way, and not adequately, I'm sure, but I'm trying, is that God's involvement in the day-to-day affairs of people is not as much as people think. This is the idea of deism. The deism. You don't see them use the Almighty. Providence, Washington uses a lot. He doesn't say God, doesn't say Jesus. Franklin is the same. But then Jefferson is strange because he goes and takes a Bible and copies the words of Jesus into a separate book, which is now commonplace in New Testaments, right? The words of Jesus are in italics or in a different color or whatever. They're in red, boldface sometimes. And he did that. So it's an interesting dichotomy with him. His political enemies said that. They literally said, hide your Bibles if old man Tom gets elected because he's going to burn them into a giant heap. Not at all true, but we know how politics got. And for everyone who thinks that, the good old days, political parties never said such terrible things about each other. Yeah, they did. They did from the get-go. As you're going to read in that book, and it will become perfectly clear. I mean, Hamilton and Burr shot at each other. I mean, for everyone who thinks this is as bad as it gets in 2021, I will tell you, no. Fist fights regularly broke out, not from people, protesters, insurrection, whatever. We're not going to label it, whatever happened 2 weeks ago. But I mean, with each other. I mean, it almost happened last week where we had a couple of congressmen who didn't want to certify another one, but it happened routinely. And there was a joke in Congress in the 1850s, a person who isn't armed with a revolver and a knife is armed with 2 revolvers. So that was like everyone's carrying back then. So again, this kind of idea of things were just simpler and they were more civil back. No, they weren't. No. John Adams called Alexander Hamilton the Creole bastard brat of a Scottish peddler. And as we know, a lot of that was somewhat true, but it didn't mean, and then the people who were aligned with Hamilton called Adams a bald, fat, toothless man without the sensibility of a man or the caring of a woman. Yeah. I can play the 1800 political commercial for you when we get closer to 1800.
Ventura literally wrote a book called Crap Politicians Say.
Yeah. So anyway, we're getting a little off track, but that's okay. So the third, we went through the legacy of the American Revolution. The fourth, this is important. The idea that the founders upturned an idea that sovereignty, power, where political power existed, sovereignty, had to exist in one agreed upon location. The king, the parliament. Nope, it's split. Federal and state power could exist together, and they all had a role to play. There were overlapping sources of authority in the United States. The Congress did this, the states did that. Or the states did everything Congress said that only Congress can do, and we're leaving everything else to the states. Oh, by the way, we're also leaving everything else that's not to the states, to the people, which is written in the amendments of the Constitution. Fifth, the founders created political parties as channels for ongoing debate. What's that? It was a mistake to think that they probably were going to not have political parties and to acknowledge that they're necessary. You have to channel the ideas of your party into a structure and an entity, which is a political party. And the founders said, we're not creating political parties. We are creating political parties, even while they were. Jefferson and Madison's botanical tour of New England. Just 2 dudes going up to look at the flora and fauna up there in Massachusetts. Nope. Yeah, they did. They did this during, I want to say, the end of Washington's presidency. What's that?
That's a weird name for a campaign.
It's not a campaign. They're just 2 guys from Virginia going up to Massachusetts to look at birds and stuff.
That sounds so creepy. I'm sorry.
It's not, except it's a cover for
They're campaigning.
they're testing the waters of, are their ideas going to get any traction outside the American South and Atlantic states, New Jersey and New York? They might. So they always denounce political parties as they created political parties. And on the other side, of course, you had Washington and Adams and Knox and Edmund Randolph and all them saying, well, we're not political party, we're the government. Well, you kind of are a political party just because you're the existing force that's in charge. England had political parties. They were political parties in the American colonies. You know, East versus West, court versus country, the well-to-do versus those who are not as wealthy, who were elected into politics, merchant class, farming class. I think the representations of those do exist in the parties. So here's the challenge with the two founding moments, of course, and we'll talk about those in detail. The idea that there were, again, 5 achievements of the revolutionary generation, but there are 2 competing founding moments. The first is in 1776. This is the argument of the book The Quartet and others who have said this. So we have the American birth certificate as the Declaration of Independence. June, July 1776, the formal break with Great Britain. The second revolutionary moment is 1787 and 1788. The idea that American nationhood to succeed needs a stronger government. Now, why are those 2 ideas possibly diametrically opposed? Let's explore that notion. Number 1, the Declaration is a radical document. It's, to this day, we know it's maybe flawed. It says all men are created equal. They don't really mean it. Endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Well, we'll give some credit where credit is due. They didn't say the Christian Jewish God. They said their creator. That meant whoever you think started everything with certain unalienable rights. Okay, but let's get into how it applies to government with the natural rights. The idea of power is in the person, the individual. That's one of the takeaways from the Declaration of Independence. Government is an alien force. Again, endowed by the creator, certain inalienable rights. Government are instituted by the consent of the governed. So the Declaration says you enter into a government so you don't have, and make a pop culture reference, the purge going on. Right? The movie where everyone says laws are all off today. Drive as fast as you want. Covet thy neighbor's wife, murder anybody you want to do, whatever. The purge, exactly. So we don't have that kind of crazy state of nature, Hobbesian dystopia, where the world is nasty, brutish, and dull, as Hobbes said. We create a government which is protecting individual rights and liberties. It's almost a reluctant act. It's like, yes, we give the consent of the government to do this. But if the government fails in its duty to do this, you overthrow it. So the right of revolution exists. Rebellion is a natural act. Again, insurrections, rebellions, these are loaded words. But, this is built into the United States as a nation. This idea that if government, it's the Lockean theory of contractual government. If government fails in what it's supposed to do, you overthrow it. You shouldn't, it's not your right, it's your duty. I mean, people should do this. It puts the onus on the individual to say, look, Great Britain in this case has completely abdicated its ability to govern the people in the colonies, and there should be a new government constituted, which they do. The Constitution, I said the Declaration was a radical government, a radical document. Again, the Declaration does not form any form of government. You all are advanced students. I try to drill this point home to students in 2010. Not all of them are history majors, and not all of them understand this. The Declaration of Independence does that and that only. Because I always ask the question on exam time, what are the parts of the Declaration? And inevitably, someone checks off Constitution and Bill of Rights. It's not in the Declaration because people fuse together both of the founding moments. Okay, all the Declaration does, and I beg students to understand this, is declare independence. If you're not sure what it does, remember the name. That's it. There are no 3 branches of government. There is
It happened like almost 20 years after it was written.
11. 11. We go from 1776 to the draft in 1787.
Why at this point? I thought it just felt like 122 now.
It may have, if you were not doing well in the 1780s, it may have felt like a long time because, you know, we'll talk about what the government of the revolution is. It's not the Constitution, it's the Articles of Confederation, which sets up a weak government. Okay, so the Declaration is radical and the Constitution is conservative. Sovereignty is not in the individual in the Constitution, it's in the people. We the people, which was maybe going to be we the states, until someone said, no, let's change the preamble. We the people of the United States. Government is an essential protector of liberty. Wait a minute, how do we go so fast from government is the threat to government is the solution? Interesting. Well, the 1780s happened is what happened, is the answer. What happened in between 17? And that's the crux of a lot of arguments when the historians have gotten involved and asked these questions. Did the revolution in 1776 and the changes, I mean, Congress told the states, rewrite your constitution. You're not a colony anymore, North Carolina. You're the state of North Carolina. You're the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, which they still call themselves to this day. Rewrite your state constitutions. And the floodgates of democratic change happened. And some people are like, holy fill in the blank. This is too much. Too much. This is democracy, a bad word, run amok. Notice I'm using the words Republican form of government and not using democracy a lot because that's what the founders feared. Feared.
Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
It goes back to their time as a colony, going back to William Penn giving the charter to create it by the king and them essentially just keeping that connection there. Yeah. I mean, originally, what was the name of Rhode Island? The Rhode Island Plantations. Now, were there plantations that we think of, which would be agriculture, slaves? No, it's just planting people, the plantations. I mean, they called the colonies early on the plantations, Plymouth Plantation. We connected, not surprisingly, with our image of what plantations in the South. It's chattel slavery, it's large land, and it's agriculture. But the name means other things. I mean, when they talked about planting people, they're talking about planting colonists. So yeah, that's a connection going back to before they were actually states. So this is the question brought up in 1787. Did the Constitution have to be necessary to put the brakes on the democratic excesses, not the Democratic Party, the excesses of democracy that were happening around the United States? That's one theory. That follows the theory that the Constitution is a conservative government. It had to be established to bring about social balance. What's also interesting about this story is that sometimes those who participate in the revolution don't always participate in the aftermath. The revolutionary leaders are, sometimes they die, sometimes they become actually in charge in some kind of tyrannical form, replacing one form of a government with another that's their own creation, with putting them in charge. And maybe that's what was happening in the founding era. The same elite were straddling both occasions. Doesn't always happen in revolutions. Those that led the French Revolution, well, they were quickly gone away with, and then we see, of course, the rise of Napoleon. So in the American founding, it is uncommon for the same men to make a revolution to secure it. Stated differently, to make the revolution and also secured it. And that's what this group did. But it's 11 years apart. So that's, again, where we're going to be dealing with in the first couple of classes. Okay, that's what they did accomplish, the 5 significant accomplishments of the revolutionary generation. And while we bask in the glow of the founders, we should recognize what they did not do and could have done. And a lot of people now say should have done, but that gets into how many 21st century values will you try to backtrack and put on the 18th century generation.
Now we have to get behind that, but yeah.
yes, we have to bring up the limitations of the revolution while at the same time being careful not to say, I don't understand why George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and Ben Franklin didn't understand global warming. I mean, you can't put what we know and understand as a concern back in their lives. Again, that's maybe not the greatest example. Maybe it is because they would have been absolutely, not even cognizant of that.
Indian affairs, like, why didn't they establish more, like, rights, given to the Indian nations?
Exactly. And I would chalk that up as one of 3 or 4 major limitations of this group. The biggest failure is slavery. It is the darkest shadow is slavery, and the failure to end it or put it on a path to end it. And it's not like the example we used of, the earth is finite with what's out there with natural resources. This group just thought it would never ever end, but they live with slavery. So this is a difference. They didn't have carbon emissions and other things to deal with, but they did and were slave owners. And all of the prominent founders realized the embarrassing contradiction that existed with the institution of slavery. And they also knew that it was a stain on their legacy at the time. If you went back and looked and said, you can grab one of these folks like Franklin or Adams or Jefferson and say, you could have done more with this. They would just kind of hung their head and said, yeah, we could have. With others, maybe not as much. If you said, why didn't you give full equality to women? They would have laughed and said, women voting? I mean, that might have been their answer.
A woman being president?
Right. That would have been, but I'm showing you the difference here. You use the example of Native Americans. Something should have been done to either give them some citizenship rights or to create a way by which you could live among or with the surviving Native American nations. And they probably, like slavery, would have, we could have done better with that too. Or not. Others would have said, well, it's just we're going to drive them to extinction. And they may or may not have had a problem with that. So, the founding generation leaves slavery. By this, I mean the aftermath of the revolution, intact, south of the Potomac River. And from the Potomac River and from the south, it is a base by which it will spread like a cancer in the American Deep South and with the potential to go into the West. In our time, in our class, it will move into Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. It will possibly move into the Northwest Territories if Congress hadn't acted on that. Combination of factors, some of which they didn't even realize was happening, that the black population was growing nearly as fast as the white population because slave owners thought, oh no, if we stop bringing slaves in from Africa and the Caribbean, the institution will go away. It's like cutting underneath of the tree, the roots, and then watching the tree above the ground die. And some folks said, yeah, that's the point. We should do that. And others, they didn't realize what was happening that allowed it to move. By natural increase, slavery was going to move. Then we have a combination of factors, opening up the lands in the West, cotton. No one could foresee mass productions of cotton, and then sugarcane. Sugarcane is always overshadowed for some reason by cotton, but it's very, very important to South Louisiana. So those factors and the factor that they let the slave trade alone for 20 years allow it to move on. The slave population of the United States grows eightfold from 1776 to 1860. This is even with, in 1808, the international slave trade stopping. Stops in 1808. The U.S. is supposed to stop participating in it. The other shadow is the failure to implement a just and generous Native American policy. Absolutely. In the course of this class, we're going to talk about numerous attempts that tried and utterly failed. Washington tried. Why? Because Knox told him, if you don't get this right, it's going to look really bad. And these gentlemen, as you read in the Freeman book, are concerned above almost all else, reputation. How will people, literally, they're thinking this, how will people 200 years from now judge the decisions we make? They know that slavery is a huge failure. Jefferson would later say, at the end of his life, we have the wolf by the ears. You hold on, it's bad. Let go, it's unthinkable. The wolf by the ears. And he said that over the Missouri Compromise debates in 1820, again, towards the very end of his life. Native Americans have the legitimate claim to the soil of this continent. They command the moral conscience of the nation, and the founders, I think, knew it. Those of them that cared about this understood that, recognized it. And like slavery, we see a parallel because from this super creative generation, they can't come up with solutions to these problems. Madison would probably say, if you put him on the spot, look, you want one nation or two or three. We made compromises because we had to. And slavery is one of the compromises. So the Indian policy, it fails to create kind of a spirit the founders you think would have. Or maybe they just thought it was insoluble. They couldn't figure it out. There was no solution that was going to work. And of course, the seeds are planted for Indian extinction east of the Mississippi, already sown. Those seeds of really an extinction that happens from the East Coast to the Mississippi River by the late 18th century, and then again paves the way for what takes place in the Plains years in the later part of the 19th century. All right, so given all of this, we have a great story to tell. A great story to tell in the course of the semester. It's a story of grace and sin, grandeur and failure. We may err on two extremes of the story when we tell it. Again, 60 years ago, the founders were demigods. They could do no wrong. Look what they put together. It's amazing. Or they're a cast of villains who collectively compromise the richest, snobbiest, and whitest men in American history. So somewhere in between that is the story. Villains or demigods. That's what was said about the Constitutional Convention. A meeting of the demigods. Well, they weren't that, of course. They were flawed human beings. And so this is where we introduce the concept of historiography, the history of this time period, which will, again, kind of get a little bit started today and then finish up next time. During the last 40 years, there has been a distinct love-hate relationship with the players who started the United States. A love-hate relationship. Most academic historians have essentially abandoned them in order to shift the focus to other groups, those that were kind of marginalized in the periphery of the story. Women, slaves, Indians, the inarticulate. And that's a good thing, because if you always tell the story from the top down, you don't get the whole story. The mainstream great men history is overworked, these folks say, with nothing else to say. The narratives of race, class, gender make the founders racist, sexist, and classists, a rogues gallery. So these are the two extreme arguments. Now, if that is the case, then why do people still fascinated by this generation? Because we still have a lot to learn for them. And it almost creates this idea. Here it is, written in the notes. If you abide by this rogues gallery and that the founders were folks who didn't get enough done, you engage in what's called presentism, this idea of our values going backwards to the 18th century. Because this group failed to free the slaves, failed to offer full political equality to women, failed to grant citizenship to Indians, failed to create an economic world in which all could compete on equal terms. No, they didn't do any of that. But this debate, which is usually written among academic circles, books that historians and people who teach at colleges write kind of for each other, meaning not the general public don't. Thankfully, this debate, whether or not the founders were, again, demigods or an evil rogues gallery, doesn't often trickle down to the general reading public. Why? The general reading public read for fun. And reading books coming out of academic presses is not always fun. Now, the story's changed, thankfully. And what happened because the story changed? In the 1960s and 70s, women and African Americans and other minorities started to go to graduate school and get doctorates and masters. And all of a sudden we go from this kind of heroic interpretation of the past, the great white men theory, to, okay, who started the revolution? Who made it happen? Was it the elite folks in the different colonies, or was it others? Or was it the Jack Tars, as the term came for folks who worked in seaboard communities and were the part of what I call the pitchfork and torch crowd protesting British policies? What did slaves hope to gain in the American Revolution, or free people of color in the North? Narratives that weren't really considered until the last 50 or so years. Now, 50 years is a long time in our minds, but it's in the history of the history, it's still fairly recent. So yeah, you tip the balance, right? The pendulum goes one way to the other. Right? The great white men theory, and then you have history from some say below, which is okay, but does it, each one kind of mutually excludes the other as being, everyone's part of the story and part of it is important. So these scholarly debates are scholarly debates, meaning those of you who go and want to read a good readable book on history, don't pick up these little micro studies. Or you might, if you're into reading history or a history major. Most folks, of course, pick up these books to cure insomnia. Again, the audience is, these folks, I'm not downplaying the fact that they are important, these very micro and condensed studies of certain aspects of history, but audience is something that we always have to consider. So stated another way, and this is stated by Ellis himself, I think it's in Founding Brothers or the other book, The American Creation. Historians dedicated to a recovery of the experience of ordinary Americans have chosen to abandon ordinary readers in the present, preferring to communicate only with each other. And maybe that's okay. Maybe, every person who works at a university and writes a book would love to have mass appeal to it, but it's not always going to have mass appeal. And that's why you have sometimes some resentments between people who write for a general audience and those who don't. Well, David McCullough isn't a PhD and he's not an academically trained historian, and as if he can't research like anybody else who has a pointy head and got a doctorate at an Ivy League college. At the end of the day, he's making bank because, he's selling a lot of books. Ron Chernoff wrote a giant book on Hamilton, which Mr. Manuel picked up and read and said, wow, similarities here between my story, an immigrant story, and Hamilton. Chernoff is a journalist. He's not an academically trained historian. And people started reading the book, or at least buying the book, right? People buy books. I don't know if they always read them. The bestseller list is not the best reader list. It doesn't mean that everyone who buys these books reads them. Nevertheless, what I'm saying in all of this is there is a gap in the knowledge. And it's somewhat changed, as we're going to find out more and more in the 1990s, as we get into kind of the founding father chic that happened. And I think John Adams was the start of it. So this group never really goes away, but now it's a nuanced story, better and more enriching than it would have been 50 or 60 years ago. Not long ago, if you travel to Monticello, the staff there was told, we're not even going to include the possibility that Thomas Jefferson had a whole separate family of mixed race children, that he had a family with Sally Hemings, one of the slaves that he owned. And then the DNA evidence came out. African-American author who was a lawyer, Annette Gordon Reed, wrote a book called Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings and said, look, the science doesn't lie. It's either Jefferson or his brother, because it's that X chromosome. It's either one or the other. And from that, initially, the reaction was, no, can't believe, and the scholarly community all weighed in. And then you can accept it or not. But a lot of people accepted it and said, yes, I mean, the man is a widower. She is owned by him. She doesn't have a choice, really. He owns her. But people began to say, all right, what was this relationship like other than master and slave? They had children together. That's clear. And then from there it became a whole book on the Hemmingses of Monticello. Same could be applied to Washington or other of these folks, Madison, who was a slave owner as well. You know, you now write from a perspective of this individual, the so-called great white man, can be involved, but we also involved the other part of the story where we thought, well, you know, just afterthought that they were a slave owner. Now, well, why don't we look at the slaves of Mount Vernon? What was their life like? What was Washington like as a slave owner? Then we get into the whole thing about, you know, a kindly slave owner, as if that term can actually exist, and one who was not. I mean, by all accounts, they say Jefferson was a kindly owner. Well, you're committing the most unkind act by owning other people, but you can also, like that, sell slaves and split a family apart. So we go from, okay, the heroic stories of these individuals who single-handedly led the rebellion to, in the 1960s and 70s, a different perspective came about. And that's good. It's made the subject of history better, I think. So that's essentially where we'll leave everything. I have a couple more things to say about, just as an intro to the class. And then we'll get into next time the 1780s. So this was kind of just to introduce some of the themes for the class. Next time we'll challenge the idea of whether or not this was actually you know, a critical period for the United States, if the nation was on the cusp of failure, what the challenges were. There were really some that did exist, and how the government was able to or not able to address them. That's where we're going to head next time with the class. So we will see everyone Thursday. Thank you all for joining us on Teams, and have a good day. See you back here Thursday.